December 22nd, 1944, Bastogne, Belgium. As snow fell incessantly on the ruins of the besieged city, 4 German officers advanced with calculated steps. At the front, a white flag. In his hands, a typewritten ultimatum. "Surrender, or you will be annihilated." They smiled. There were 30,000 soldiers surrounding 18,000 hungry, freezing, unsupplied, and unsupported Americans. From the point of view of German doctrine, surrender was only a matter of time and formality. This trust was shared by the generals of the Nazi High Command. Bastogne was the logistical center of the offensive. His fall was inevitable. The American soldier, they said, was dependent on comfort, logistics, and air superiority. Without it, it would break like glass. But what the Germans called weakness, it was about to show itself as industrial resilience and strategic faith. This is the account of the greatest tactical reversal of the Battle of the Bulge. A narrative where the mechanized doctrine of the Wehrmacht found something it didn't understand: logistical flexibility, technical improvisation, and an impossible march led by American tanks breaking through the ice with steel mathematics. They demanded surrender. What they received was a word, and 250,000 soldiers advancing with it on their lips. Crazy. They thought the Americans were crazy, and they were right. But before we dive behind the scenes of this operation, there's one statistic that defines everything you're about to see. As 18,000 besieged Americans dug through the frozen ground with their hands, with no food, ammunition, or air support, an army of 250,000 men began to move more than 200 kilometers away. In just 72 hours, 133,000 vehicles crossed ice-covered roads, guided by almost useless maps, under the orders of a general who had already foreseen the impossible. This is the story of when German military logic, based on speed, armor, and numerical superiority, broke down in the face of an adversary that was not supposed to resist. An army considered slow, improvised, and dependent on infrastructure. It proved capable of repositioning 500,000 liters of fuel, recalculating all its artillery, and breaking through a siege where nothing should survive. If you value accurate research and believe that history still holds lessons about courage, intelligence, and strategy, consider supporting this channel. Leave your like, subscribe, and share this video with those who also want to understand how a single word, nuts, destabilized all the arrogance of an army that swore to win. For the German General Staff, American resistance at Bastogne was not a plausible variable. It was a temporary anomaly, about to be crushed. From the beginning of the war, German doctrine had nurtured an almost folkloric image of the United States soldier, a uniformed civilian, shaped more by the comfort of industry than by the harshness of the battlefield. It was a view reinforced by speeches by Hitler himself, who in 1943 claimed that the American army was a noisy mass of workers guided by generals who only run on maps and gasoline. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt was even more incisive. They can't stand prolonged pressure. They fight well with sun, tanks, and planes. Take that away and break it. This assessment, while arrogant, directly influenced critical decisions. The offensive in the Ardennes, Hitler's last card on the Western Front, was planned based on this conviction. Bastogne, for example, was supposed to fall within 48 hours. It was the logistical center of the region, and, according to German calculations, without air support and supplies, the Americans would surrender before the 3rd day. That estimate ignored a silent factor: the U.S. logistical capacity to operate in any climate, in any terrain. And he ignored something even more dangerous: the willingness of the American soldier to resist even when doctrine said he should not. Wehrmacht military manuals found after the war described American methods as overly dependent on continuous supply and slow to reorganize under attack. This vision was not just technical, it was ideological. The Nazi military elite saw Americans as products of a materialistic culture, unable to maintain cohesion under deprivation. The brutal irony: the same soldiers who were underestimated because they depended on supply would be the ones who, even without it, would dig trenches with helmets and resist the siege for 9 days straight, with 1 meal a day and water extracted from the snow. This German myopia also extended to American industrial power, often treated as bloated and inefficient by Third Reich intelligence. In 1944, while Germany struggled to keep 200 tanks operational per month, the United States produced 2,500 tanks, 4,000 planes, and more than 50,000 trucks every 30 days. The production ratio was so absurd that for every German armor destroyed, the U.S. Army could replace it 5 times over, with enough logistics to get it to the front in less than 2 weeks. If this data surprised you, comment "Logistics wins," because that's the key that explains what would come next. American superiority was not only in the factory, but in the doctrine of the use of the material. While the German army still operated under the linear model of fixed fronts, the U.S. Army tested flexible models of motorized infantry, decentralized communications, and mobile logistics chains. German commandos still relied on the telegraph and motorized messengers. The Americans were already using short-range radio on a large scale. Each platoon in Bastogne had at least one PRC-6 radio for tactical communication. This detail, considered irrelevant by German doctrine, was essential. It allowed encircled units to coordinate defense, redistribute ammunition, and call in artillery surgically. Nazi doctrine called this type of decentralization disorganization. What was disorganization for Berlin became resilience in Bastogne. This underestimation contaminated all German planning for the Ardennes. Operation Wacht am Rhein required Bastogne to be taken within 2 days, as all major routes passed through it. However, the German schedule did not provide for prolonged resistance, nor did it consider the effect of logistical failures of its own, such as fuel shortages. The failure of prediction was exposed as early as the 3rd day of the siege, when the 2nd Panzer Division was forced to slow down for lack of diesel, while the Americans, even surrounded, still operated their tank destroyers with rationed and internally reorganized supplies. The belief that the American breakdown would be swift made the Germans despise reinforcements, delay supply lines, and ignore signs of an American reorganization underway to the south. "They will not resist the siege," General Hasse von Manteuffel wrote in a message intercepted by Allied intelligence. But they resisted, and the resistance was only the prelude. Because what the Germans didn't know was that, more than 200 kilometers away, an American general was already on the move, and what would come would not be an operation. It would be a maneuver unprecedented in modern military history, an unprecedented crossing in the middle of winter under ice, commanded by a man who had already foreseen the fatal mistake of the Germans even before the first shot was fired. His name, George S. Patton, and the order had already been given. In the heart of the Ardennes forest, the small Belgian town of Bastogne occupied a geographical point that, until then, had never been highlighted in the strategic analyses of the war. But for Hitler's plan, it would become the central link between ambition and failure. 7 major roads converged on Bastogne, like vital arteries in a rudimentary logistical system. It was the only point where German armor, coming from multiple directions, could regroup, refuel, and advance en masse toward the real objective of the offensive: Antwerp. Capturing the port in northern Belgium would allow it to cut the Allied lines in half, divide the British and Americans, and possibly force a partial peace agreement with the West, so that Berlin could focus on the Soviet advance east. But there was one non-negotiable condition: Bastogne had to go down in the first 48 hours. Without it, the German timetable would collapse. The offensive, dubbed Wacht am Rhein, Watchman on the Rhine, depended on movement, fuel, and liberated roads. Bastogne was therefore more than a tactical objective. It was a strategic bottleneck. The Germans knew this, and so do Americans, by instinct or calculation. The 47th Panzer Corps, under the command of General Heinrich von Luttwitz, was tasked with breaking through and taking Bastogne quickly. The force deployed was formidable. 30,000 men, armored personnel carriers of the elite 2nd Panzer Division, veteran units of the Panzer Lehr, and the 26th Volksgrenadier Division. Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt himself oversaw the offensive in the sector. On paper, the equation was simple. Bastogne would be surrounded, pressed into full force, bombarded to surrender, and turned into a foothold for the advance westward. But the operation ran into a problem that German intelligence did not anticipate. The American 101st Airborne Division was already on its way. No tanks, no winter clothes, no updated maps, just in a hurry. They arrived in the city in makeshift trucks, crossing columns of retreating Allied soldiers. There was no clear order of defense, but there was an instinct to hold Bastogne at any cost. The German plan, hitherto based on speed and local superiority, suddenly faced a new kind of obstacle: American unpredictability. German logistical reports show the degree of urgency. To maintain the advance, each Panzer Division needed at least 100,000 liters of fuel per day. The Luftwaffe, limited and exposed, could not guarantee continuous air support. This put even more pressure on the roads. Bastogne became not only desirable, but indispensable. And with each day that it did not fall, the advance schedule of the armored columns began to deteriorate. The frozen ground, initially favorable for displacement, began to alternate between ice and mud as temperatures cycled. Heavy tanks bogged down, ammunition trucks broke down and blocked single-lane roads, and what was supposed to be a winter-adapted blitzkrieg turned into a sequence of armored traffic jams under leafless trees and overcast skies. Hitler, far from the front line, demanded results. Luttwitz, at the top, saw the minutes slipping down the sides of the stationary panzers. Meanwhile, inside Bastogne, the Americans created something that German doctrine despised: a defense with no fixed lines, with light infantry, operating by sectors, reorganizing after each attack. The Germans, accustomed to breaking continuous front lines, were faced with scattered nuclei of resistance, interconnected by radio and resupplied by improvised routes, even at night, by soldiers who were guided by the smell of campfire or the muffled sounds of gunfire. When the surrounding roads were cut off, the city turned into an island of resistance. But for the German General Staff, this was still a temporary failure. American resistance was seen as a retreat under delay tactic, that is, part of a standard behavior of encircled units that would soon surrender, especially without air support or heavy artillery. Bastogne was not a fortress. It was an anomaly that, in the German calculation, would be corrected. The mistake was not realizing that, while the Germans were trying to make their way along the roads, the Americans were already operating under another logic, keeping the logistical node closed as long as possible, even with losses, to delay all the enemy machinery. This logic was not included in the Wehrmacht manuals. They expected resistance until such time as supplies ran out. What they did not expect was the decision of the American High Command to do the impossible: a total turn of Patton's Third Army to relieve the city. This was not included in any German plan. Bastogne, in Berlin's eyes, was not just a point. It was a bridge to advancement. But it ended up becoming the wall where time stopped. With every hour that passed without Bastogne being taken, Germany lost mobility, fuel, weather, and the surprise factor. The doctrine of the lightning offensive, which had worked so well in Poland, France, and the early stages of the Soviet Union, began to creak in the Belgian forests. An officer of the 2nd Panzer Division would write in his diary, days later, "The city has not yet fallen. The roads are full. Fuel is counted in liters. Every extra minute is one step less. The center of the German offensive, through which the future of the Reich was to pass, was becoming its turning point. And while tanks stopped for lack of diesel, in the south, American tanks were already being filled, reoriented, and prepared for a march that will defy all manuals. Because when Germany believed it had closed in on it, America had already opened a new flank, and he came with 250,000 soldiers. By dawn on December 21st, 1944, Bastogne was no longer a city. It was a crater of ice and smoke, surrounded by rings of steel and silence. The roads were blocked, the roofs covered with thick snow, and the surrounding fields turned into icy graves of charred tanks and soldiers scattered in frozen positions. The 101st Airborne Division, reinforced by remaining units of the 10th Armored Division, had been completely surrounded. The Germans closed each access road, positioned siege artillery in a semicircle, and established a zone of total containment. General von Luttwitz's orders were clear: cut, isolate, silence, and watch the progressive breakdown of American resistance. The radio stopped, the external sounds too. The German command adopted a calculated strategy of tactical invisibility, limiting direct hits, preserving ammunition, and inducing psychological collapse through isolation. But Bastogne did not go broke. Within the city, the scenario was one of absolute scarcity. The supplies had been designed to hold the city for a maximum of 3 days. By the end of the second, there was no more morphine. In the room, the meat was already rationed in pieces of frozen canned goods, and the only water came from the snow itself. Soldiers with inadequate boots began to show necrosis in their toes. Doctors amputated with field knives heated in a candle fire. There wasn't enough anesthesia for everyone, and even so, the defenders dug in. They dug with bayonets, empty cans, even bare hands. The trenches were not just defense, they were shelter from the biting wind that reached 20 degrees Celsius. The forward positions were held by rotating pairs of men who took turns every 2 hours to avoid complete freezing. With no air cover, limited artillery, and only light infantry ammunition, the city held. The German command was intrigued. Interrogations of captured prisoners revealed that American soldiers knew they were surrounded, knew they would not be rescued anytime soon, and knew supplies were running low. Still, no plan for surrender was mentioned. A German interrogator reported in a diary, "They act as if there is an army coming behind them, but there is not. We know that." It was true. There were no visible signs of reinforcements. The roads to the south were frozen. Patton had not yet begun his movement, and flight conditions precluded any air aid. But the German mistake was to believe that the Americans surrendered for lack of choice. In reality, they were learning to fight without options. The impasse became moral. German doctrine predicted that an isolated force with no lines of communication and under constant attack would yield by military logic. What happened in Bastogne defied that logic. The city wasn't just resisting, it was adapting. The commander of the 101st, General Anthony McAuliffe, reconfigured his defensive lines into mobile sectors, utilizing reconnaissance platoons as improvised artillery elements. Every mortar piece was repositioned for sectoral coverage. The streets were mined by hand, with improvised explosive devices taken from grenades, and the radios that remained were redistributed among smaller units to maintain internal communication. The city has created its own defense ecosystem, even without light, without heat, without reinforcement. Schools have become screening stations. Churches were transformed into infirmaries. Belgian children hid in basements, while American soldiers exchanged the last M1 carbine cartridges. German silence, once a pressure tactic, has become a capsule. They no longer listened to broadcasts. They no longer picked up displacements. Only sporadic fighting in the vicinity. The siege was working, except for the detail that the city would not budge. And with each passing day, the Germans lost what was most valuable to them, time, because with time, fuel would come. With fuel, tanks would come, and with tanks, Patton's army would come. In the first 5 days of the siege, the Americans fired fewer than 10,000 shells, less than a single division would use on a normal battle afternoon. Still, they repelled 6 coordinated attacks by the 26th Volksgrenadier Division. Each attack left more bodies freezing in the trenches, which the Americans took advantage of as natural barriers. The bullets were gone, but the ice remained. A soldier would later report, "When you run out of ammunition and you keep fighting, something inside you changes." The Germans would call this something irrationality, but maybe it was just conviction. The German command began to accelerate the plans. They knew that Bastogne was close to collapse. But they didn't know that the collapse wouldn't be American. A report on the 24th brings the first evidence of unrest. The 2nd Panzer communications officer wrote, "The city does not surrender. Maybe they're waiting for help. We must consider the possibility of a counterattack." On the same day, winds began to blow from the south. The climate has changed. The sky began to open. And with it would come the most dreaded sound of modern warfare, aviation engines. Because when the Germans believed they had won by silence, they heard the buzz that heralded the return of the American airline industry. And what would come from heaven? It would change everything. On the freezing morning of December 22nd, the siege was tightening. German bombardment had already reduced parts of Bastogne to smouldering ruins, supplies were stretched to the limit, and the temperature was dropping below 20 degrees. It was the perfect setting for a surrender. It was then that 4 German officers crossed the front line with a white flag and a printed, clean, precise document. They demanded the unconditional surrender of the American forces under threat of total destruction. They took the proposal to the barracks of the commander of the 101st Airborne Division, General Anthony McAuliffe. The German message was formal, clothed in pretended civility, to save unnecessary suffering. But the answer they received was neither military nor diplomatic. It was just a word. McAuliffe read the proposal, paused, and said to the officers gathered in the room, "Ah, nuts!" His aides laughed. But one of them suggested, "General, why not make that the official answer?" McAuliffe nodded, and so it was. The message typed and delivered to the Germans only read, "To the German commander, nuts, the American commander." A single word, 4 letters, no explanation. On the German side, the message caused perplexity. The interpreter tried to find a direct equivalent. "Nüsse?" one of the officers asked. "Is it slang? Is it an insult? Is it mockery?" The confusion wasn't just linguistic, it was moral. These men had offered the Americans an honorable way out of the inevitable. They expected a hesitation, a tactical justification, perhaps a request for time. What they received was derision. This word, simple and absurd, destabilized the logic of the siege. How could a commander, with soldiers freezing, dying without reinforcement, laugh in the face of the enemy? The psychological impact was immediate. The message circulated among German officers, and along with it, the doubt. If they are mocking, what do they know that we don't? Inside Bastogne, by contrast, news of the response spread like a dry fire. Soldiers, until then exhausted, wounded and hungry, laughed with their teeth broken by the cold. Nuts became a password, greeting and watchword. It was painted on damaged tanks, written in blood on helmets, carved into wooden walls. One paratrooper said that night, for the first time in 5 days, he heard jokes being told between trenches. McAuliffe's response wasn't just resistance, it was strategic derision. It was a clear message: we still have a choice, and that, more than ammunition, renewed the defense. Germany, which believed so much in psychological warfare, tasted its own poison. Nuts became a symbol of a new phase of the siege. It was no longer just about tanks and positions, it was about spirit. The US Army, accused by its critics of being too industrial, too logistical, too impersonal, showed that its most lethal weapon was not steel. It was the moral refusal to give in, and this refusal was inexplicable for a doctrine that saw war as calculation. A German commander captured after the battle would say, "They must have been defeated, and they were less in what mattered." The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. It was enough to understand that they were not dealing with desperate soldiers, but with determined men. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts in depth, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can bring you more in-depth behind-the-scenes content on the war and the decisions that changed the course of history. Because sometimes a word is worth more than a battalion. But the Germans still did not know what would come from the south. They did not know that at that very moment, 16 American divisions were already on the move. And at the head of them, a general who did not believe in retreat, and who had prepared his army to maneuver like no other in history. The answer that started with nuts was about to gain steel tracks and engines roaring under the snow, because the greatest countermarch offensive of modern warfare had already begun. And it would come like thunder on ice. While German forces projected over the Ardennes with the confidence of a surprise blow, in the south, an American general was already operating in another time. Not in the present of the crisis, but in the future of the response. George Smith Patton, Jr., commander of the Third Army of the United States, was not caught off guard by the German offensive. 3 weeks before the attack, Patton had already ordered planning exercises for a possible enemy advance in the region, including the possibility of a winter offensive in the Ardennes sector. Their corps commanders were assembled for what they called immediate displacement scenarios. 3 contingency plans were created and codified. In all of them, Patton called for rapid redeployment of troops northward, crossing ice, mud, and secondary routes. When the German offensive finally revealed itself on December 16th, Patton didn't have to improvise. He just activated what was already ready. Patton's mind operated with an unconventional logic by the military standards of the time. He combined tactical aggressiveness with an obsession with supply. For him, the army that moved the fastest was the one that could keep his soldiers supplied even in chaos. Prior to the offensive, Patton had already positioned fuel depots in alternate zones, identifying possible logistical bottlenecks. When the order to move toward Bastogne was given, the Third Army had 450,000 gallons of gasoline stored at key points along forest trails and dirt roads, ready to fuel an unprecedented winter march. German doctrine relied on surprise. Patton relied on premeditation. The irony did not go unnoticed by Allied officers. While British intelligence was still debating whether the German offensive was real or diversionary, Patton was already plotting the exact points where his armored columns could cross the frozen terrain and where the supply convoys were to be redeployed. He authorized engineers to clear roads that were not even on the main map, anticipating blockages and congestion created by the German logistical collapse. In the meeting on December 19th, before General Omar Bradley and Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower, Patton did what seemed impossible. He promised to deploy 3 entire divisions, the 4th Armored, the 80th Infantry, and the 26th Infantry, within 48 hours, covering more than 150 kilometers of hostile terrain. Bradley doubted it. Eisenhower hesitated, but Patton only replied, "They're already moving." And they were. More than 250,000 men began to turn like cogs on wheels, rails, and boots. It was a precision mechanical dance. The armored columns of the 4th Armored Division were distributed among 3 parallel axes to avoid blockages. Logistics officers reorganized supplies using alternating convoys. 1 truck of ammunition, followed by 2 of fuel, 1 of spare parts, and 1 of food. Every 10 kilometers, maintenance detachments were positioned to replace damaged tracks, repair frozen engines, and adapt tires to the icy ground. German tanks received heated oil with improvised burners to prevent them from freezing before startup. It was not only a military operation, but an industrial one. Patton also applied a doctrine of decentralization that contrasted directly with the rigid centralism of the Wehrmacht. Each division commander was given margins of autonomy to redefine routes, regroup columns, and improvise bridges with local resources. This allowed the Third Army to maintain movement even in the face of natural obstacles, occasional ambushes, and miscommunications. An engineering platoon from the 130th Infantry Division built 4 bridges in less than 12 hours over partially frozen rivers, using local trees, metal plates, and destroyed vehicle cables. Every minute saved on the crossing meant 1 minute less of agony in Bastogne. Germany, which had staked everything on speed, discovered too late that the United States had turned industrial slowness into a coordinated force. While the Wehrmacht sacrificed tanks for lack of diesel, the Third Army moved columns of 10,000 vehicles with real-time scheduling and fueling. A field report by Patton himself noted, "We are no longer an army, we are a stream." And the flow was unstoppable. Patton's real trump card, however, was in the integration between field intelligence and logistics execution. Reconnaissance teams with short-range radios were sent ahead, not to fight, but to map every obstacle, every bridge destroyed, every dangerous turn. This data was sent to command trucks equipped with cartographers and logistics operators who updated routes in real time. It was a kind of rudimentary GPS, powered by radio and speed. No other army in the world, in December 1944, was able to adapt its movements with this elasticity. By December 22nd, as McAuliffe was saying nuts to his encirclers, Patton's tanks were already advancing at 30 kilometers a day in terrain where the Germans could not keep armor for more than 12 hours. The Wehrmacht still thought it had a day's advantage, but the timeline had changed. And by the time the first American planes finally tore through the clouds with supplies for Bastogne, the fate of the siege was already sealed. Germany, which swore it had taken the Allies by surprise, found that it had been anticipated, not by luck, but by calculation. In a captured diary of a German major, a note dated December 23rd read, "The attack is advancing, but something is wrong." They already knew, and they really did. Because while the German generals dreamed of free roads and quick capitulations, an American general had already done the math. And he was about to show that, when planning meets logistics, not even winter stops a march. But the ice still held one more surprise, and it would come from the sky, in parachutes and wooden boxes. The real miracle of Bastogne began not on the battlefields, but on the back roads of France and Belgium, frozen, narrow, and covered in a treacherous blanket of ice. There, far from the immediate front, the largest logistical deployment operation ever carried out by the United States Army up to that point in the war was taking place. In just 72 hours, Patton's Third Army repositioned 250,000 men, 133,000 vehicles, and more than 20,000 tons of military equipment, in constant snow, at risk of ambushes, and with the urgency of a military watch that admitted no failure. It was a march against time, against winter, and against logic itself. With each kilometer, the gear became more fragile. Trucks tipped over on icy curves. Drivers slept standing up, tying the steering wheel with belts to maintain steering while changing shifts. Men marched 40 kilometers a day with 35 kilograms of cargo on their backs, crossing forests and unnamed villages. Still, the column was moving forward, because retreating was not an option. The heart of the operation was the M4 Sherman tanks. Each unit needed 175 gallons of fuel for each full cycle of advance and combat. It was a brutal amount, especially in a scenario where every liter had to be transported by trucks on precarious roads. To do this, Patton's engineers created 40 mobile gasoline tanks, distributed on parallel tracks with fuel stored in barrels artificially heated by buried braziers. This apparently logistical detail was one of the reasons why the American armored vehicles were able to maintain their average speed during the march, while the German panzers, even with an advantage in armor and firepower, stopped after each combat due to lack of diesel. Mobility, not brute force, was the differentiator. Mechanics operated 24 hours a day in forced shifts with tools that froze in their hands. Many used pieces of canvas soaked in hot oil to heat the joints of the engines, while scraping layers of ice from the radiators with bayonets. Tanks that broke down were not abandoned. They were towed by rescue vehicles or partially dismantled, with parts redistributed to others. There were direct orders. Each armored vehicle should be operational at the end of each day, whatever the cost. And it was expensive. At least 17 soldiers suffered third-degree burns for trying to heat metal parts with direct fire, and dozens had their fingers amputated by frostbite during maintenance. But the chain of operation did not break. Patton had said, "War is simple. Whoever moves first wins." And the Third Army moved as if the fate of Europe lay in its wake. On the secondary routes, traffic control was as intense as that of a large city. Military police officers have set up screening and orientation posts every 10 kilometers, equipped with SCR 610 radios and maps updated every 12 hours. When the terrain became impassable, engineering platoons improvised wooden bridges, dug drainage ditches, or even blasted rocks to make way through blocked turns. One of the engineering commanders wrote, "If the road does not exist, we create one. If there is no bridge, we use the tanks as a bridge." And they did. In 3 documented cases, tanks were positioned side by side in small streams, so that trucks could drive over their carcasses as if they were metal platforms. But perhaps the most symbolic detail of the march was the blind faith that men placed in order. Many did not know where exactly Bastogne was. They only knew that there was a city besieged, that the men there were resisting, and that the Third Army was their only chance. This belief, coupled with Patton's unwavering command, kept the columns moving even without visibility, without rest, without guarantees. The divisions that made the most progress during those days were not necessarily the most equipped, but rather the most disciplined, the best stocked, and the best assimilated to the spirit of adaptation that Patton demanded. It was a war won by decisions made days before the first shot. While the Germans were still trying to consolidate their lines of attack, the Third Army had already formed a semicircle south of Bastogne. The 4th Armored Division took up position to cut off the German rear, while infantry units prepared for a synchronized offensive to the north. From a logistical standpoint, this meant that every artillery piece, every truckload of supplies, and every man had to be exactly where he needed it to be, at the right moment. A 30-minute error in the schedule would mean total mismatch, and even so, the deadlines were met with margin. It was as if the American machine had been built not just to fight, but to endure error and still move forward. By the end of the 72 hours, more than 100,000 gallons of fuel had been burned, 71 tanks damaged, and hundreds of vehicles had to be replaced or retrofitted. But the line was reached. Bastogne was now within visual range of Patton's armored columns. The city, which should have been taken in 2 days, had been resisting for 7, and the army that the Germans believed was hundreds of miles away now roared less than 20 miles away. A German prisoner of war, interrogated on December 25th, declared in shock, "They went through the winter as if it were a dry road. We didn't know it was possible." But it was. Because where surprise failed, logistics triumphed. And when the sky finally opened, the skies showed that America still held more than one trump card, this time in the wings of bombers and supply planes that would descend on Bastogne as a promise fulfilled. The town of Bastogne, covered by a thick white veil, had been transformed into a theater of shadows. The dense fog choked out the sound, hid movement, and isolated each trench as if it were an island. Among the rubble, soldiers of the 101st Airborne clasped hands on the frozen rifles and watched in silence the diffuse shapes move in the distance. At night, the attacks came in waves. The Luftwaffe, even weakened, dropped bombs guided only by old coordinates. A makeshift hospital, set up in the basement of the Saint-Pierre church, was hit hard. Doctors amputated limbs by candlelight. One of them used brandy to clean open wounds. There was a lack of anesthetics, antibiotics, gloves. Every hour, someone died who could have been saved. If there had been light, if there had been heat, if there had been time. And there wasn't. Winter was the new commander of that city. In the absence of drinking water, soldiers melted snow on helmets, boiling it over cans of rations set ablaze with tiny strands of gunpowder extracted from cartridges. Every 100 yards, a man trembled with bandaged fingers, waiting for the next German offensive, because the attacks came, day and night. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division was attempting to test the perimeter defenses, sometimes probing with scouts, sometimes attacking with assault groups supported by mortars. The Germans imagined that they were just pressing a hollow shell, but each charge was met with concentrated fire, coordinated counterattacks, and unreasonable resistance. The radio, hitherto silent, now transmitted only short orders, repeated between platoons that could not always confirm receipt. The men defended blind positions, shooting toward noises. Still, Bastogne did not give in. On the other end of the line, German commanders were beginning to realize something they could not explain. The besieged city was not behaving as a collapse point, but as an increasingly cohesive nucleus of resistance. German doctrine predicted that combat morale would drop by as much as 70% after 5 days of total siege. But interception reports showed just the opposite. A Wehrmacht major wrote, "They do not surrender, they shout, 'nuts!' And that seemed to echo in every trench like an absurd code of honor. Inside the makeshift hospital, a Belgian woman moved among the wounded non-stop. Her name, Renée Lemaire. A civilian nurse, she remained in the city after the evacuation. It became a symbol not only of compassion, but of unwavering faith. When asked by an American doctor why she had not run away, she replied only, "Someone needs to be here when life comes back." The medical situation was unsustainable. A single surgeon cared for more than 150 critical cases. Each gauze was reused 3 times, and the internal temperature of the houses barely exceeded 3 degrees C. Still, the soldiers remained in position. The fog prevented any air support. No plane could break through the white ceiling that sealed the city's sky. American artillery was limited to a few surviving guns, and ammunition was rationed with mathematical coolness. One logistics officer calculated that if the siege lasted another 3 days, there would be no more cluster munitions, only rifle bullets and hand grenades. But it was not the artillery that held Bastogne. It was the decision to stay. It is at this point that the contrast becomes unbearable for the German military logic. While the doctrine of the Blitzkrieg was based on the psychological breakdown of the enemy by speed, the Americans resisted the speed persistently, and without any visible outside support. The Germans did not know that the force approaching from the south moved like a hydraulic system, invisible but growing. And meanwhile, every hour that passed in the encirclement was a strategic victory for the United States, because time now was on their side. In this scenario of agony, the statistic that sums up the German miscalculation emerges. In December 1944, American industry produced, on average, 15 times more artillery ammunition per month than Germany. If this data surprised you, comment below. Shocking data, because it is with this kind of advantage that a war is won even before the decisive battle begins. The Germans didn't just underestimate American morale, they underestimated its ability to multiply force where there was no way. At the end of the 8th day of the siege, a German officer declared, "Maybe they are just waiting for a miracle." But the miracle was already in motion. It came in armored columns, loaded trucks, and planes with supply boxes labeled "Urgent, Bastogne." The sky was still closed, but a loophole was enough, a sunny morning was enough. And what was to come would come with parachutes, precision, and a roar of engines that would finally break the siege of silence. On the morning of December 23rd, the sky over Bastogne was no longer a solid wall of fog. For the first time in more than a week, the sun cut through the cold with a metallic glow. The clouds began to give way, slowly, revealing a pale, jagged blue that opened like a heavy curtain being pulled from above. The air seemed lighter, almost unreal, and it was then that the first engines appeared, distant, like thunder coming from another dimension. Dozens of C-47 aircraft, the sturdy freighters of the United States Air Force, began to tear through the silence with a sound that was no longer just mechanical. It was spiritual. Below, in the ruins of Bastogne, soldiers and civilians looked up in disbelief. From each plane, hundreds of colorful parachutes descended slowly, carrying more than supplies. They brought survival. 30 and 50 caliber ammunition, boxes of food, morphine, radios, batteries, even chocolate and thermal gloves. Everything that had been denied by the storm now fell from the sky with mathematical precision. An American paratrooper, upon seeing the first container land near his position, fell to his knees and began to cry. It wasn't just relief. It was confirmation that they hadn't been forgotten. Days earlier, while the sky was still closed, Patton had gathered his chief chaplain, Colonel James O'Neill, and made an unusual request, an official prayer for good weather. "Write a prayer for the end of the damn rain, and make it efficient," O'Neill wrote. Patton distributed thousands of copies among his men and ordered the prayer to be read aloud by each unit. The next day, the sky opened. Superstition or not, the fact is that the coincidence has become a legend, and the legend became moral fuel. When the planes appeared, even the most skeptical recognized something had changed. The army that depended on roads now proved that it could also dominate the heavens. And the impact was immediate. The airlift set up by the Air Force used hundreds of aircraft in constant rotation, dropping supplies through predetermined zones with color codes. It was a symphony of coordination. Each package was laced with multiple parachutes to reduce impact. The drop zones were signaled by smoke and flags made with sheets or remnants of uniforms. In less than 48 hours, more than 350 tons of cargo were delivered directly to the besieged perimeter. This included 18,000 boxes of K-rations, 15,000 sterile bandages, 50 tons of light and heavy ammunition, as well as SCR-300 radios, which would allow tactical communications between battalions to be resumed. It was the largest air resupply operation up to that point in the war, and it worked with the precision of a factory. From a technical point of view, each C-47 could carry between 2.5 and 3 tons of payload. The challenge wasn't just to keep the flow going, it was to ensure delivery safely under anti-aircraft fire and into visually disfigured territory. Pilots flew at low altitude, many of them under the age of 25, trained to drop the payload based on minimal landmarks: a partially destroyed turret, a bend in the road, a smoke slick. Still, the error rate was minimal. Of the 970 containers launched on the first day, more than 780 were successfully recovered within the American perimeter. The rest fell into the neutral zones or were rendered useless on impact. Almost none fell into German hands. It was Allied engineering transformed into a divine response. The Luftwaffe, weakened, tried to react, but his incursions were punctual, disorganized. Many German planes could not even take off due to lack of fuel. And even those who arrived in the region faced American anti-aircraft artillery reinforced by the newly landed pieces via parachute. Each German attack was countered with concentrated fire. Bastogne, who had been imprisoned for days, began to bite, and the German command realized that time, once allied, had changed sides. Now every minute that passed favored the besieged, because they were alive, armed, fed, and they knew that cavalry was no longer a promise. It was a certainty. The moral impact was devastating. In interrogations with captured German prisoners over the next few days, many reported that the sight of the colored parachutes broke the offensive spirit. A sergeant in the 77th Division stated, "We thought they were about to die, and then we saw the sky open. We were not prepared to fight an army that talks to God and receives an answer." Technical superiority also became psychological, because while the Germans fought with timers of ammunition and supplies en route to exhaustion, the Americans demonstrated that they could rebuild an army from the air. Industry wasn't just a machine, it was an invisible web of support that emerged when all seemed lost. And here's the statistic that defines that momentum. In just 2 days, the American airlift delivered more supplies to Bastogne than all German ground logistics could move to its offensive during the same period. If this impressed you, comment below. Logistics wins. Because that's exactly the point. Modern warfare is not won by bravery alone. It is won by systems that work even under fire, by engineers who never enter combat, by pilots who fly without knowing the face of whom they are saving. Bastogne, still besieged, now roared, and the Germans knew that the time for the offensive was running out. But what they didn't yet know, what they couldn't predict, was that among the armored vehicles advancing south, a group of tanks from the 4th Armored Division had already broken through the ice. They were less than 15 kilometers away, and they came as a steely answer to the word nuts. In the early hours of December 25th, as the world celebrated the birth of a savior, Bastogne was preparing to face his own final judgment. The German High Command, pressured by the stagnation of the offensive and the failure to bend American resistance, decided to launch a last brutal direct assault on the besieged city. The order was clear: take Bastogne at any cost. Under a still murky sky, 18 Panzer V Panther heavy tanks, supported by medium armor and infantry in winter camouflage, advanced through the eastern sector of the perimeter, where the defense was most tenuous. German strategy was based on brute force and technical superiority. The Panther outnumbered American tanks in armor, range, and firepower. Nazi doctrine bet everything on a lightning break, a deep penetration that would destabilize the defenders and collapse the American core. It was the last roar of the besieged beast. But on the other end of the line, there were no tanks. There were hunters. The U.S. Army's 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, equipped with the speedy M18 Hellcat, had received reinforcements and new orders. Do not retreat, do not face head-on, do not waste ammunition. The Hellcat was a paradoxical adversary, light, flimsy armored but incredibly fast. The fastest American armored vehicle of the war, capable of reaching 90 km/h in open country. He couldn't survive the impact of a shot. He avoided it. Its strength was in the maneuver, in the ambush, in the lateral fire at close range, where even giants fall, and that's what happened. The Germans advanced like metallic colossi, smashing trees, smashing walls, and spitting 75mm shells. The infantry, camouflaged in white cloaks, moved in a wedge, occupying houses and preparing support positions. But as the Panthers crossed the first defenses, something strange happened. No American shots, no movement, just silence and ice. It was then that the Hellcats appeared. Coming out of alleys, slopes, and barn bottoms, they attacked the exposed flanks of German tanks with speed and accuracy. The shots from his 76mm guns hit the weak points, behind the turrets, between the tracks, under the hull. Each impact was followed by a fireball that swallowed the surrounding snow. 3 Panthers were destroyed in less than 2 minutes. The German infantry, disoriented, tried to reorganize, but it was hit by 50 machine guns and short-range mortars positioned on upper floors. What was supposed to be a coordinated advance turned into a tactical panic. German radio was invaded by confusing transmissions. "We lost contact with Line 3. I request immediate retreat. Where are the reinforcements?" None came. The Hellcats continued their lethal dance, using speed as their armor. One of them rounded a damaged Panther and hit it from the rear with 2 shots. Another, operating with its crew nearly frozen, fired 5 times in less than 30 seconds, destroying 2 vehicles and damaging a third. The symmetry of German doctrine, based on force and front, collapsed in the face of the asymmetry of American thought. Mobility, adaptation, local initiative. The 705th Battalion lost 4 Hellcats that morning, but it caused losses that would reverberate in the German command for days. 12 enemy tanks destroyed, dozens killed, and an advance completely neutralized. When the smoke cleared, Bastogne was still standing, and more importantly, it was now breaking the siege with its own means. It was no longer a besieged city, it was a turning point, a symbol, because there on Christmas Eve, the world witnessed the collision between 2 modes of war. On one side, the heavy, centralized, rigid machine. On the other, the flexible mind, the improvised response, the spirit that does not follow manuals. German doctrine failed not because it was weak, but because it did not foresee opponents who thought outside the axis. In the post-combat reports, a German officer wrote, "The American tanks were weak, but they were everywhere. We never knew where they would come from. It was like fighting ghosts." And maybe they were. Because that morning, the army that many considered technically inferior demonstrated that winning a battle isn't just about gun caliber. It's about knowing where and when to fire. And while the Panther's smoke still rose over the horizon, a new threat loomed. From the south, from the forests cleared by Patton, guided by radios that kept repeating a single word: advance. Ahead of the column, the tank marked with the words Cobra King was advancing with charred flanks and turrets spinning like a lurking predator. It was December 26, 1944. In command of the operation was Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, at the head of the 37th Tank Battalion of the 4th Armored Division. His mission: to break through the last German bottleneck south of Bastogne in the village of Assenoir, a seemingly insignificant rural intersection, but one that held the tactical key to the collapse of the siege. On the other side, elements of the 5th Fallschirmjäger Division and remnants of the 26th Volksgrenadier held fortified positions between stone houses, hedgerows, and minefields. To get there, Sherman tanks would have to cross narrow roads, unstable bridges, and face the concentrated resistance of a troop that, although worn out, struggled with the desperation of those who knew that the siege was hanging by a thread. Abrams didn't just count on courage, he counted on calculus. Before the advance, he ordered the synchronized firing of more than 2,000 artillery shells in less than 30 minutes. Each sector of the village was divided into quadrants. Barrages were timed to precede the advance by seconds, creating a curtain of fire that disoriented and disrupted the German defense. It was war as engineering, cold, timed, systematic. At the same time, field radios operating on the SCR 300 frequency ensured constant communication between artillery, tanks, and infantry units coming close behind, clearing streets and searching every basement. Each 100-meter advance was preceded by precise calculations of time, type of ammunition, and degree of expected endurance. Nothing was left to chance. It was the opposite of the blitzkrieg tactic. While the Germans bet on chaos and rupture, the Americans won by the meticulous order of the details. German tanks, often underestimated for their thinner armor and limited armament against German Panthers and Tigers, prove there that victory depended not on isolated technical specifications, but on integrated doctrine. At Assiniboia, each tank advanced with lateral support from 50 machine guns, M2 mortar cover, and an infantry squad with flamethrowers and demolition charges. When they encountered resistance in a fortified house, they did not try to take it by force. They surrounded it, isolated it, waited for the moment of coordinated fire. At every corner, a tactical decision, and at each decision, the clear influence of logistics that allowed for boldness. No unit advanced without knowing that behind it there were guaranteed supplies, repairs, and evacuation. The final assault began at 9:32 a.m. 3 armored columns entered by parallel routes, each timed with a margin of 30 seconds. Assiniboia, taken by surprise, resisted for 1 hour and 17 minutes. The last focus of resistance, a church tower turned into a machine gun nest, was neutralized with concentrated fire from 2 Shermans and shells thrown from the belfry. At 10:49 a.m., the Cobra King received the order to advance to the point of contact with the 101st Airborne, and that's what he did. As it crossed the last enemy line, the tank came across a group of exhausted, ragged soldiers, some still with frozen bandages. They raised their arms not to fight, but to salute. The connection was silent. A soldier from the 101st later wrote, "We hear nothing but the engines, but it was the most beautiful sound of the war." Bastogne was no longer surrounded. The encirclement, built with arrogance, calculation, and contempt for the enemy, had been broken by a force that was not based on brute force, but on total synchrony between logistics, command, and field engineering. From an operational point of view, this was the definitive breaking point. The supply line was restored, medical evacuation routes could work, long-range artillery could now be repositioned freely, and more than that, the strategic initiative had changed hands. The German offensive, which depended on the capture of Bastogne to sustain the momentum towards Antwerp, had been decapitated at its vital center. American doctrine, often called unrefined by German generals before the war, demonstrated what tactical maturity meant. Integration between sectors, flexibility in command, and above all, resilience sustained by an industrial base that never slept. While smoke was still rising from Assiniboia's destroyed rooftops, Creighton Abrams received a cipher message. Contact established. Situation under control. Initiate medical evacuation. It was a simple sentence, but behind it, an operation that involved more than 250,000 men, 133,000 vehicles, 350 tons of supplies dropped from the sky, and countless human decisions made under ice, starvation, and death. Bastogne had resisted, and now he was fighting back. And in the German barracks, far away, a general noted in his diary, "We underestimated not only their resources, we underestimate his conviction." What he didn't know yet was that for Americans, this was only the first answer. Total retaliation was yet to come, and it would come like a steamroller over the Ardennes. The instant the first American armored column crossed the southern line and entered Bastogne, there were no fanfares. There was no time for ceremonies. But there was something more powerful. Silence, followed by an emotional outburst. Wounded soldiers in the makeshift basements of hospitals began to scream with joy, still with morphine in their arms and frozen bandages on their bodies. Exhausted men, their faces covered in soot and sunken eyes from interrupted sleep, threw ammunition in the air as a celebration. A paratrooper from the 101st, upon seeing the Cobra King pass by, jumped over the armored hull and kissed the tower. It was a moment of contained euphoria, born not of surprise, but of the conviction that the impossible had been overcome. General Anthony McAuliffe, the same one who had written "Nuts" days earlier, greeted the officers of the 37th Battalion with a firm nod and a dry phrase, "We are happy to see you." And that was it. Bastogne had resisted, and now he answered. But as the city vibrated like a rekindled moral furnace, something broke on the other side of the front. Interrogations conducted over the next few hours with captured German officers reveal a change in tone that no Nazi manual had predicted. A lieutenant of the 26th Volksgrenadier, when asked about the failure of the siege, replied, "We did not fail because of lack of ammunition. We fail because they just won't budge. They look like demons of steel." This perception was not isolated. An intercepted report from the command of the 47th Panzer Corps stated, "American resistance is beyond operational logic. Time no longer works in our favor." It was the beginning of the collapse, not just of an offensive, but of a belief. Because until then, German training had been built on the idea of doctrinal superiority. The Wehrmacht saw itself as an unbeatable tactical machine, underpinned by centuries of tradition and an elite of officers trained in Prussian rigor. The American soldier, on the other hand, was presented as a mass force, poorly trained, spoiled for supplies, and frail without air support. It was this image that had underpinned the German calculation that Bastogne would fall in 2 days. The image of an army without the courage to endure the cold, without the discipline to resist without radio, and without doctrine to fight in isolation. But now, that narrative was in ruins. Bastogne had not only resisted, she had won. With improvisation, with faith, with logistics, and this was something that German doctrine could not explain. What the Germans ignored was that in 1944, the United States was producing more tanks, more trucks, and more ammunition than all the Axis powers combined. In a single month, American industry threw into the field the equivalent of an entire year's worth of pre-war German production. What's more, while the Germans struggled with logistical lines stretched to the point of collapse, the Americans had created 11,000 kilometers of routes on wheels, with moving stockpiles, line repairs, and medical evacuation by air. Pause for a statistic that the Nazi generals preferred to ignore. In December 1944, the United States produced 45,000 military trucks. The whole of Germany, in that same month, produced less than 5,000. If this data impresses you, comment below. Shocking data. Because that's exactly where war changes its nature, when numbers stop being abstract and turn into tangible advantage on the front lines. This victory in Bastogne was not only territorial, it was symbolic. Soldiers who had been eating snow and sharing socks for days were now surrounded by convoys bringing hot coffee, fresh ammunition, and letters from home. The sight of these convoys, GMC trucks, Willys jeeps, M8 armored vehicles, and M32 recovery tractors, was an industrial procession advancing along the newly unlocked roads, as if the entire rear of the United States had crossed the Atlantic to liberate that city. And he did. Not just with steel, but with messages. Each restored radio broadcast the same bulletin. Bastogne is free. The news traveled across the front like electricity. At outposts to the north, American soldiers began to sing. In London, Churchill interrupted a meeting to give a standing ovation, and in Berlin, Goebbels closed his eyes for long minutes before continuing his New Year's speech. Bastogne had become the symbol of what was to come. On the battlefield, the German lines began to disintegrate. Troops that had once marched with precision now retreated in disorganization. Entire units deserted under the cover of night. More experienced officers reported increasing panic, bouts of indiscipline, and in some cases, quiet mutinies. In the Ardennes, the 2nd Panzer Army began an unauthorized retreat, and on Hitler's map, drawn with maniacal precision, the black dot over Bastogne was scratched with anger. From then on, the Ardennes offensive ceased to be a plan and became a mistake, but there was still more. Because as the Germans retreated, Patton prepared to attack, and when he attacked, the ground shook. Bastogne had been the key. Now the door was being broken into. The victory at Bastogne was sealed in the maps and trenches, but its foundation was far from the spotlight of glory. It pulsed behind the scenes in tarpaulin-covered warehouses, in convoys that advanced into the night, in makeshift radio stations in the middle of the forest. During the advance to break the siege, Patton's Third Army didn't just move 250,000 men. It set up an invisible network of support that defied any logistical precedent in military history. In just 3 days, engineers and support units erected 70 temporary supply points along secondary highways, each functioning as mini distribution centers for fuel, ammunition, feed, and medical supplies. When trucks got bogged down or broke down, which was often the case on ice-covered roads, the barrels of gasoline were transported by hand, with soldiers pushing 55-gallon drums up the hill, often under enemy fire. In total, more than 500,000 gallons of fuel were moved in manual operations during the offensive. The cold was not just an obstacle, it was an enemy. Maintenance soldiers report losing touch of their fingers while repairing damaged tracks and frozen engines. Still, no trains stopped, because stopping meant wasting time, and time was all Bastogne didn't have. In parallel, communication was woven as a silent web behind the lines. More than 20,000 miles of telephone wire were unwound, connecting mobile units to forward command posts, artillery to field observers, and engineers to replacement depots. This network, set up in less than 72 hours, allowed orders to be transmitted with a delay of less than 10 seconds between units tens of kilometers apart, a feat that no European army had even attempted until then. While the Germans still relied on motorcyclists and messengers for critical communications, the Americans spoke by wire, by VHF radio, by pre-established codes. The American supply warfare doctrine did not depend on a center. It was built on mobile, independent modules that could operate in isolation for up to 72 hours. This decentralization allowed that, even under siege or occasional failures, the general flow was not broken. It was a logic based on anticipation, predicting collapse, and already having the mobile solution in motion. Unlike the Germans, who plotted fixed railroad-based routes and relied on pre-existing stations, the Americans took their infrastructure with them. The field was dynamic, and the logistics adaptable. It is at this point that the conflict ceases to be just physical and becomes philosophical. While German doctrine saw war as an exercise in force and surprise, American doctrine saw it as an equation of surrender, resistance, and replacement. Behind the scenes of the Battle of the Bulge, mobile workshops were created capable of performing tank maintenance in less than 6 hours, replacing entire systems even with knee-deep snow. Welding, electricity, and hydraulic workshops operated in the open, with generators transported in adapted trucks. There were also mobile kitchens, field laundries, and mail distribution systems, which delivered letters to soldiers even during the siege. All this existed not by excess, but by understanding. Morality and efficiency are children of structure, and structure wins wars. The invisible engineering of victory also inhabited the silence. In the quartermaster officer's spreadsheets, each infantry unit received its supply package with ration, ammunition, blankets, and standardized spare parts. This meant that any convoy could supply any unit, without relying on specific codes or requisitions. War was treated as an industrial operation, and soldiers as operators of an adaptive gear. When one supply line went down, another was already being activated. When a bridge was destroyed, combat engineers would throw Bailey bridges, prefabricated metal structures that could be assembled in less than 3 hours by just 20 men. More than 180 such bridges were installed between 16 and 27 December, allowing the advance to continue even under bombardment. This vision of war, based on redundancy and mobility, clashed directly with the German model, based on concentration and predictability. When the Wehrmacht High Command analyzed the post-Bastogne reports, it found one constant: Americans kept reappearing. When one train was destroyed, another replaced it. When a tank broke down, a repair team would emerge. When one position was taken, another was already being prepared. There was no fixed point. There was flow. An officer of the 5th Panzer Division wrote, after being captured, "They are like water. They slip, they surround, they come back. We never know if we win or just push." It was the recognition of a doctrine that was not genius for its maneuvers, but for its articulate persistence. And it is at this point that the figure of the common soldier gains a new contour. Because behind each maneuver was a radio operator sitting under the ice, typing messages with cut gloves. There was a driver who drove 14 hours straight to deliver spare parts. There was an engineer who improvised a bridge with burnt beams and reused screws. None of them received medals in Bastogne, but they all built the victory. A victory that was born in the rear, in the improvised depot, on the muddy map where someone wrote, "Here you need more diesel." It was there that the siege began to crumble, and what the Germans called American improvisation turned out system. In the War Archives, a document sent by Patton to Eisenhower sums up this logic with military clarity. Advance 100 kilometers in 72 hours, 0 supply failure, 0 isolated unit, only possible with movable frame, repeat when necessary. Repeated. Because Bastogne was not a miracle, it was a manual. And in the following days, this manual would be opened once again, this time with a bigger target: the total collapse of the German offensive. While the American boots sank into the frozen mud of Bastogne, above them another kind of war was being waged, silent, risky, and absolutely vital. When the weather finally allowed, the U.S. air engine descended on the besieged city like a logistical hammer. Between December 23rd and 27, an unprecedented operation turned the sky of Belgium into a mobile supply line. Airlift Command launched 961 missions with C-47 aircraft, delivering more than 200 tons of supplies directly to the perimeter of the 101st Airborne Division. The recovery rate was 95%, amid shelling, anti-aircraft fire, and minimal visibility. Each flight was a risk sentence. The pilots flew low, at only 300 meters of altitude, in a straight line and without evasive maneuvers, to ensure that the parachutes fell at the exact point. There was no luxury of safe altitude and no time for course correction. It was precision or death. The burden was not just material, it was moral. Boxes of morphine, blood plasma, .30 caliber ammunition, K-rations, blankets, radio batteries, and even family books and letters descended like multicolored blessings from the heavens. A paratrooper reported that when he opened a box, he found cookies and a letter written by children from Ohio. Soldiers cried when they saw the parachutes open, not out of fragility, but because they knew that someone, hundreds of miles away, had remembered them. The airlift, supported by a continuous stream of day and night flights, prevented the collapse of the siege. When the doctors no longer had anesthesia, boxes of morphine fell. When the rifles threatened to fall silent for lack of ammunition, entire belts of cartridges descended. The war, which seemed frozen on the ground, was rekindled in the air. This operation was not improvised. Since September, the United States had already structured an air support doctrine based on logistical mobility. The Bastogne airlift was the first major test, and it worked. The C-47s, originally commercial transport aircraft, had been adapted for high-precision tactical operations. Their compartments were redesigned for fast charging, their radios reprogrammed for real-time coordinates, and their crews trained to sail at low altitude under fire. While the Germans still relied on overloaded locomotives and vulnerable convoys, the Americans dominated the third dimension of the battlefield, the vertical. One statistic sums up this doctrinal turn. During the 5 most critical days of the siege, the U.S. airlifted more supplies than the Germans could send overland to all of their top divisions in the region. It was the industrialization of relief, and the sky had become the new arsenal. More impressive than the quantity was the constancy. The C-47s took off in waves, fueled by a perfect chain of hangars, depots, and technicians who operated 24 hours a day in the rear. For each air mission, there were 18 specialists on the ground, from the crate loader to the timing operator. It was the power of Detroit, Chicago, Philadelphia, and Seattle materialized in the form of parachutes. Every engine that roared over Bastogne brought with it the echo of factories that did not sleep. The Luftwaffe attempted to fight back, launching interceptions and bombardments on supporting airfields, but it was weakened. By December 1944, the German Air Force had already lost supremacy. Its pilots flew less, its aircraft were in chronic maintenance, and fuel was rationed. Meanwhile, the U.S. was manufacturing 200 new transport planes that month alone, enough to supply 3 fronts simultaneously. The industry had become wing. The Bastogne airlift was not just a technical feat, it was a strategic revolution. It proved that even without airports, runways, or roads, an armed force could be sustained entirely from the air. This broke the traditional paradigm of siege. It was no longer necessary to break through the blockade. It was enough to fly over it. The impact of this echoed in post-war military doctrines, inspiring future operations such as the Berlin Air Corridor in 1948 and air supply in Vietnam. But in 1944, it was all new. It's all risky. A pilot from the 439th Transport Group wrote, "We knew that each flight could be the last, but we also knew that if we failed, Bastogne would fall." They did not fail. The irony was not lost on the German reports. In documents recovered after the battle, there are bitter references to the American Flying Factory and the Parachute War. An SS officer noted, "We surrounded the city, but we couldn't surround the sky." This phrase, almost poetic, captured the frustration of an army that operated with terrestrial logic in the face of an enemy that thought in 3 dimensions. The war was no longer just about movement, it was about surrender. And in this field, the Americans had become experts. And then, on the last day of the airlift, something symbolic happened. A C-47, hit in the wing by light fire, made a forced landing near the perimeter of Bastogne. The crew survived, and upon opening the damaged fuselage, soldiers of the 101st found the last supply boxes intact. One of them bore a simple label, "For those who still resist." That was the message behind every flight, and the reason Bastogne never folded. Because while the Germans struggled to hold the front line, the Americans replenished hope with industrial regularity. But the most extraordinary was yet to come. Because the same Air Force that had saved Bastogne from collapse, it would now be used to push the enemy back. Not just with supplies, but with bombers. And what started with parachutes would end with fire from the sky. On the morning of December 27, 1944, what was left of the German troops around Bastogne began to retreat. It wasn't an organized retreat. It was a dissolution on purpose. Panzer IV and Panther's tanks were abandoned on the side of the roads, not because of breakdowns, but because of an absolute lack of fuel. Camouflaged infantry groups, once disciplined and lethal, dropped fortified positions overnight, leaving behind weapons, documents, and even supplies intact. The siege had broken, yes, but what was breaking there was something deeper, the image of the German army as an invincible machine. For the first time since the war began, a coordinated Wehrmacht offensive had failed to achieve its central objective, not through miscalculation, but through unexpected resistance. Bastogne was not just a strategic point lost. It was a broken mirror of German doctrine. In the interrogations conducted by the Allies after the collapse of the siege, German officers repeated similar expressions: irrational behavior, lack of tactical logic, resistance beyond human expectation. The descriptions revealed a doctrinal shake-up. The Wehrmacht had structured itself on the idea that fear was a weapon, that surrounding, cutting off supplies and isolating was enough to provoke surrender. In Bastogne, this logic collapsed. A recovered diary of a major in the 5th Panzer Division reported, "We expected surrender. We found demons." Another, more technical document analyzed the behavior of US troops as abnormal and influenced by logistical fanaticism. The irony was painful. What the Germans called fanaticism was actually a doctrine of faith in the rear, the confidence that as long as they resisted, something would come. And it did. It wasn't just reinforcements. It was an entire system that moved to sustain them. The American Air Force, which during the siege had kept Bastogne alive with supplies, now took on a new shape. B-26 bombers began hitting retreating German positions, destroying makeshift bridges and refueling columns. American logistics didn't just serve defense. It created the opportunity to counterattack. Mechanized divisions advanced at high speed, bypassing pockets of resistance and blocking escape roads. Within days, more than 11,000 prisoners were captured south of the Ardennes. The German offensive, which promised to divide the Allies and retake Antwerp, had turned into a disorderly race for survival. And it all started with one word: nuts. The breaking of the siege revealed not only the strength of the American system, but the progressive emptiness of the Nazi war effort. The German machine, once synonymous with precision and tactical superiority, revealed its chronic fragility. Lack of fuel, inflexible supply lines, and a doctrine based on offensive initiative without prolonged sustainment. Bastogne was the point where the blitzkrieg met its limit. Because modern warfare, as Patton understood it, was not won by maneuver alone, but by resupply. With every German tank stopped without diesel, there was an American convoy moving forward with spare parts, rations, and updated maps. With each Wehrmacht silent radio, there were miles of American telephone wire connecting platoons in real time. For every soldier who surrendered by starvation, there was another being replenished by heaven. Bastogne was the first German defeat caused not by numerical inferiority, but by structural inferiority. American democracy had been derided by Nazi commanders as a slow, confusing system that was too dependent on individual initiative. But it was exactly this decentralization that saved Bastogne. While German officers awaited orders from Berlin to reposition battalions, the Americans were already carrying out improvised plans based on local intelligence and flexible logistics. The decentralized structure allowed for action without paralysis. Institutional faith in the common soldier, trained, informed, and well-supplied, proved superior to the rigidly hierarchical machinery of the Reich. It was the opposite of the doctrine of fear. It was the doctrine of ability. And here's the irony of this story: the solution was in front of them all along. While the Germans saw Americans as dependent on comfort and structure, they ignored that this structure was precisely what made them invincible under pressure. If you are enjoying unraveling these facts accurately, show your support. Like and subscribe so that we can continue to bring stories that the official doctrine preferred to forget. Because the victory in Bastogne was not a miracle. It was a consequence, and their echoes did not stop there. The Wehrmacht was finally beginning to doubt. And this was the point most feared by any war machine. When doubt enters, discipline weakens. Entire troops, once motivated by the idea of technical and racial superiority, now faced American soldiers who challenged not only their bullets, but their certainties. A sergeant of the captured 26th Volksgrenadier summed up the feeling: "They must have been dead. They are smiling." It was this smile of anger, of relief, of resistance that began to turn the tide of the war. Because America's great weapon was not a cannon or a tank. It was the system that ensured that every bullet arrived, every radio worked, and every soldier knew he was not alone. And in the next part, this system would reveal its most ruthless form. Logistics converted into offensive. The siege was over. Now the counterattack began. As tanks roared on the ice-covered roads and planes cut through the skies over Bastogne, another war was waged under the rubble and torn tents. The war for life. In the shadow of the battles that shaped maps, men and women refused to let death dictate all the rules. In cold basements, bombed-out churches and makeshift structures with blankets and burnt wood, American doctors operated without anesthesia, with frozen syringes and scalpels that no longer cut accurately. The light came from candles stolen from destroyed homes. In one of these shelters, the chief surgeon of the 101st Airborne Division performed 167 surgeries in 4 days, often holding the scalpel with one hand and the flashlight with the other. His account is dry, technical, and inhuman in its heroism. There was not enough morphine nor blood plasma for everyone, but there was a choice: try or give up. They tried. Among the rubble of Bastogne, a woman has become a silent symbol of compassion in the midst of the collapse. Augusta Chiwi, a volunteer nurse of Congolese origin, refused to leave the field hospital even after direct bombing by the Luftwaffe. In the records, there is mention that in a single night she attended to more than 70 wounded, including captured German soldiers. The cold made her skin crack, her feet bleed, and yet she continued. At his side, Belgian nurse Renée Lemaire tended to those who arrived, singing low hymns to calm the dying. On Christmas Day, a bomb destroyed the hospital where Renée was staying. She died trying to save bedridden patients. There is no medal for this kind of bravery, only memory. And that's what history should: memory. One name that resonates with veterans is that of Eugene "Doc" Rowe, a nursing technician who crawled between craters to reach the wounded on the front lines. No gun, no vest, no guarantees, just his medkit and an irrational faith that if he didn't go, no one else would. In one of the night battles, Eugene dealt with 32 soldiers under direct fire. He wrote in his diary, "The only thing I heard more than the gunshots was the sound of teeth chattering from the cold." His figure became a symbol of what they called the American soul, the idea that even in the midst of chaos, someone still cared whether you lived or died. And that was the difference, because the Germans had tanks, but the Americans also had souls. These doctors and nurses operated in precarious logistical conditions. Often there was no gauze, and uniform cloths were used as dressings. Instruments were boiled in feed cans, and amputations occurred with adapted wooden saws. Even so, the survival rate of the wounded treated in Bastogne was 62%, an extraordinary number for a siege, and even more so for an environment with an average temperature of 15 degrees Celsius. This efficiency was the result of prior training, technical readiness, and the supply chain that, even under siege, still worked in parts, thanks to air deliveries and medical discipline. American doctrine provided for advanced medical teams capable of operating close to the fighting line, something the Germans deeply underestimated. Their reports branded the Americans as tactical immatures, and ignored that this immaturity was actually mobility. The presence of civilian nurses on the front lines also revealed another contrast. While the Third Reich was closed in a purely military logic, with defined functions and brutal separation between soldier and civilian, the US carried with it a moral ecosystem. The women who treated the wounded, the technicians who improvised trauma centers, the chaplains who comforted the dying, all were there as an extension of a society that refused to kill its own humanity in war. And that changed everything. Because when the soldier knew that if he was hit, there would be someone trying to save him, he resisted more, he fought more, and he didn't give in. The irony of this story is that to the Germans, All of this seemed wasteful. Moving doctors to combat zones, risking planes to deliver morphine, sacrificing nurses on behalf of condemned wounded. But it was precisely this waste that made democracy so difficult to win. She was not just fighting for territory, she struggled for meaning. If you've come this far and value the reconstruction of these human stories, show your support, like and subscribe, so we can continue to reveal what the official books have left on the margins. Because this war wasn't just about steel, it was about flesh, blood, and moral choices under absolute pressure. A campaign diary, found days after the end of the siege, contained the following entry, written by a wounded soldier on the verge of death. "If I live, it will not be because of God or luck. It will be because someone carried me on their lap here." Bastogne was not just a victory of tanks or planes. It was a victory of improvised medicine, of armed compassion, of humanity that refused to freeze. And the Germans, realizing this, began to understand that they were facing something that could not be measured in divisions or caliber. They were facing a people who valued life, and who, for this very reason, were able to face death with more strength. But if the soul had won in the underground of Bastogne, the next chapter would be decided under the cold light of engineering, because while the Germans retreated, the Americans built. And what was now being built was no longer a line of defense. It was the path to revenge. After the surrender of Bastogne, when the maps were drawn again and the troops began to bury their dead, there remained something that could not be accounted for in reports: the respectful silence of the enemy. In the German rear, far from the roar of artillery, documents, confessions, reflections began to appear. Not about the failure of the strategy, but about what in fact had been faced. Among the papers found in frozen bodies, letters sent in a hurry revealed not only longing or fear, but surprise. A letter written by a Panzer sergeant shortly before he died said, "We were expecting spoiled soldiers, with clean boots and afraid of the cold. We found men who bled, froze, and still smiled." What Nazi propaganda had defined as weakness, American humanism, had proved to be the most resistant weapon. General von Lüttwitz, the commander who led the demand for McAuliffe's surrender years after the war, would make a public statement about Bastogne. He said, "They did not fight for conquest, they fought on principle. That was new to us." She, the man who once sent the ultimatum, "Surrender or you will be annihilated," now recognized that he had underestimated not warlike strength, but moral strength. This change in tone was not isolated. In interrogations with captured officers, phrases such as "they shouldn't be standing" and "we'd break in their place" were repeated with unsettling frequency. An officer in the 116th Panzer Division confessed, "We expected discipline. We found faith." The American units had held out without air support, with supplies cut off, under continuous attack, and in freezing temperatures. And yet they maintained cohesion, initiative, and, most importantly, spirit. What was supposed to be a weak point became a foundation. American tactical flexibility, often disdained in Wehrmacht manuals, proved to be a superior form of combat, capable of improvising, adapting, and persisting even outside doctrine. Bastogne was proof of this. The 101st didn't just hold the line, it defied the logic of German mechanized warfare, which relied on precise schedules, rigid supply lines, and withering advance. American doctrine, decentralized and based on the initiative of small commanders, seemed disorganized in German eyes. But in Bastogne, she showed her genius. A commander of Panzer Lehr Division, when questioned after the battle, reported, "They acted as if they did not know they were surrounded. There was no fear in his eyes." And he completed with a phrase that would become iconic in Allied reports. "They held on to what we didn't hold on to, faith." This sentence sums up what happened in that frozen forest. A war between rigidity and flexibility, between dogmatic certainty and human conviction. While the Germans marched forward, hoping for a programmed victory, the Americans dug holes in the snow and resisted for something that didn't fit into orders: belonging, duty, community. This cross-admiration was not only symbolic, it began to weaken, little by little, the German belief in the moral and technical superiority of its war machine. Bastogne exposed that there was an immeasurable factor that the Reich had not considered. What moves a man to keep fighting when all seems lost? The Americans had inferior medium tanks, younger soldiers with less combat time, and were isolated. But they resisted. And that broke something within the German mentality, the conviction that they would win because they were more prepared. From then on, officers began to quietly admit, they have something we can't teach in our academies. The irony of the story is that the first sentence of the battle was a mockery: surrender to avoid annihilation. The last one, said by a surrendered German officer, was, they deserved this victory. There was no more derision. All that remained was the respect that is born when the enemy reveals a kind of strength that you do not possess and that you cannot imitate. Because American conviction, born of democratic faith, tactical flexibility, and a culture of improvisation, has proven to be more resilient than the rails of any tank. The victory in Bastogne was not only tactical, it was ideological, but even with respect earned, the war was not over. And the question now was another. What happens when a machine that mocked now retreats? What happens when the Reich realizes that the Allied wall is not only made of steel, but of will? The answer would come soon, with figures, smoke, and the constant sound of American engines. Because the next march had already begun. They didn't stay because of orders, nor because of the stars on a general's uniform. They stayed for something that didn't fit on the tactical maps. They stayed because the man next to them stayed too. In Bastogne, the bonds between soldiers overcame the instinct for survival. Each trench was a silent promise. If I fall, you keep going. The letters in his pockets, never sent, were daily reminders of why it was worth resisting. There was faith, not just religious, but a human, communal, intimate faith. Faith that the sacrifice would make sense, that resisting to the last cartridge would prevent other cities, other mothers, other children from experiencing the same horror. Bastogne did not become a symbol because he won. He became a symbol because he did not give in. And this difference changes everything. When an army resists the impossible, it does not only protect a geographical position, it protects a way of existing, an idea of the world, a definition of courage. In that frozen forest, the real American weapon was collective conviction. What won the German tanks, the wire fences, and the logistical siege was not a new model of weaponry. It was the old model of camaraderie. Private Eugene Rowe had no rifle. He crawled between grenades with only a bag of morphine. Belgian nurse Renée Lemaire was carrying no ammunition but continued to work under bombardment until the roof collapsed on her. And Commander McAuliffe, when he could have surrendered, responded with a word that sealed the memory of an entire generation: nuts. This spirit cannot be manufactured in factories. It cannot be imposed by regimes. It is born of values and survives gunfire. During the siege, when supplies did not arrive and the wounded piled up in the basements of destroyed churches, many believed that the end was a matter of hours. But then came reports of soldiers sharing the last candy bar, of chaplains praying with atheists, of engineers converting wrecked cars into makeshift checkpoints. In normal times, all of this would seem trite. But there, every gesture was a manifesto. It was what made those men more than numbers. Bastogne was not overcome by force. It was sustained by something invisible, commitment between equals. A German general, years later, would write in his memoirs, "We could not understand why they were still fighting. Today I understand. They were not defending a position. They were defending each other." This, more than any Sherman tank or 500-pound bomb, was what the Third Reich never managed to produce, an army that marched not only by obedience, but by choice. German doctrine, built on hierarchy, fear, and absolute duty, failed in the face of the voluntary comradeship of men who, even without food or warmth, said, "We won't leave without them." The ultimate irony is that while Germany invested millions in V-weapons and supertanks, the United States beat Bastogne with truck belts, civilian parachutes, and the faith that no one would be left behind. The logistics, the artillery, the aviation, all of this sustained the body of the operation. But the soul came from another source. It came from the unwritten oath that one soldier makes to another when he kneels beside him in a trench: "I hold until you return." And this is what the Germans, with all their war machine, have never been able to decipher. That's why Bastogne became a myth. Because there, under the ice, under the silence cut by artillery, American democracy showed its purest form. Free men choosing to resist together. Not for glory, not for victory, but because no one would be left behind. And if this idea survives in the cold, it survives anywhere. But the story still had one last page, because when Patton's tanks finally reached the heart of the besieged city, they didn't just bring reinforcements. They brought the answer to the question that echoed from the beginning: is it worth resisting when all is lost? And that answer would be written with steel trails. Bastogne, December 1944. The German ultimatum, delivered with a smile and sealed with arrogance, crossed the snow as a final sentence. But the American response did not come in the form of capitulation. It came in the form of conviction. It came in silence, in the march of tanks with frozen engines. It came in faith, in the prayer of a general who trusted more in the weather than in surrender. It came in precision, in parachutes falling over a besieged perimeter. And it came, finally, in a four-letter word that diffused more than 1,000 explosives: nuts. This word, absurd to the Germans and symbolic to the Americans, has become a moral trench. Bastogne was not just a logistical victory. It was the collapse of an ideology that relied on brute force and disdained the spirit. When Patton broke the siege, he didn't just rescue a city. He buried the Nazi belief that war was won by tactical superiority, because the doctrine that mocked Americans as flimsy soldiers was defeated by an army that moved 250,000 men in 72 hours, that set up 70 mobile depots under snow, that reconnected communications with 20,000 miles of wire in 3 days. The thesis is proven. Freedom wins when industry carries it, engineering sustains it, and moral conviction protects it. And this lesson crosses the centuries, because history rewards not only the first attack, but the last resistance. It doesn't matter the brightness of the uniforms, but the human warmth in the trenches. Bastogne's great lesson is clear and brutal. Logistics wins. Volume overcomes maneuver, and when moral conviction sustains the machine, no purely military strategy is enough. Hitler bet on surprise. Von Rundstedt relied on the doctrine of the movement. The Americans bet on redundancy, on anticipation, on the ability to transport, supply, maintain, and believe. Bastogne is the ultimate answer to the age-old question of modern warfare. What defines victory? The answer lies not only in the caliber of the cannon, but in the number of trucks, the ability to fly even without a runway, and the spirit of a soldier who refuses to withdraw. As General Blumentritt of the Wehrmacht later confessed, "We were defeated by trucks," and for a word that we did not know how to translate. If you believe that history is more than battles, that it is made of decisions, data, and courage, support this channel. Leave your like, subscribe, and activate the bell so you don't miss the next devastating historical fact. And tell us here in the comments, what was the most shocking data of this frozen crossing? The production, the number of tanks, the faith that moved Patton? We want to know. And don't go away yet. Listen to the next real story that will appear on the screen. Because the Second World War is full of other ironies, twists and turns and operations that challenge the impossible. Always remember, logistics determines strategy. Watch the next video here on the channel with another incredible story.